2 days before Thanksgiving, at exactly 6:14 in the evening, my mother sent a group text to our entire family, telling me not to come to dinner. 7 people read the message. 6 of them reacted with heart emojis. I was the only one who did not respond. Instead, I quietly closed the message, took a sip of Cabernet, and opened the confidential corporate merger file on my desk. The file contained the names of 42 employees who would be terminated on Monday morning, and the very first name on the list was my brother-in-law. My name is Nadia Carter. I am 34 years old, and that night was the moment I realized something important. Sometimes, karma does not arrive as lightning. Sometimes, it arrives as paperwork. Before we get into what happened next, tell me something in the comments. Have you ever been pushed out of your own family just because someone louder, richer, or more charming walked into their lives? And if you enjoy stories about betrayal, revenge, and justice served cold, make sure you like the video and subscribe, because what happened after that text message destroyed an entire family illusion. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The message itself was short. Brenda Carter, my mother. Nadia, we decided it is best if you sit out Thanksgiving this year. DeAndre just got promoted to regional vice president, and we want the holiday to focus on celebrating him. He feels your energy is competitive, and it might ruin the vibe. We will send leftovers. I stared at the phone for several seconds. I had hosted Thanksgiving for 6 consecutive years. I paid for the turkey. I paid for the decorations. I paid for the wine. And somehow I was the one being disinvited? Before I could even process the insult, another message appeared. This one from my younger sister, Sienna Washington. Sorry, not sorry, Nadia. DeAndre is taking us all to a luxury resort in Aspen anyway. He actually knows how to provide for a family. Maybe if you spent less time staring at spreadsheets and more time finding a man, you would not be so bitter. Then my father added a thumbs-up emoji. Just like that, 3 people erased me from the holiday. I walked to the window of my Chicago penthouse and looked down at the river reflecting the city lights. There is a specific silence that follows betrayal. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is quiet. Very quiet. I poured another half glass of wine and leaned against the counter. 5 years earlier, I had written a cashier's check for $40,000 to save Sienna from defaulting on her student loans. She had cried that night, called me her hero, but gratitude has a very short shelf life in my family, especially when someone richer enters the room. DeAndre Washington had arrived 2 years earlier. He was loud, charismatic, and obsessed with appearing wealthy. Designer watches, luxury restaurants, constant Instagram posts about success. My parents adored him. Finally, they had someone flashy enough to impress their suburban friends. I was the opposite. Quiet, private, methodical. They knew I worked in corporate finance. They assumed I was just another office worker, buried in spreadsheets. I never corrected them, not because I was ashamed, because it was easier that way. The truth about my job would have made them very uncomfortable. You see, I am not just an accountant. I am the Senior Director of Mergers and Acquisitions Integration for one of the largest holding companies in the Midwest. When our company buys another company, I arrive after the deal closes. My job is simple: identify redundancy, eliminate waste, and fire people. It is a profession that rewards calm thinking and emotional detachment, 2 skills my family helped me master very early in life. I returned to my office and opened the encrypted acquisition file that had arrived earlier that afternoon. Our company had just finalized the purchase of a media corporation called Apex Media, a mid-sized marketing firm with offices across 3 states. My responsibility was to restructure the leadership. That usually meant eliminating management positions that were expensive and ineffective. I scrolled through the spreadsheet slowly, department by department. Salary, performance metrics, expense reports. Then I reached the regional sales division. And there it was, DeAndre Washington, Regional Vice President. Salary, $230,000. Bonus eligibility, $75,000. performance rating below target for 3 consecutive quarters. I leaned back in my chair. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. The same man who had just banned me from Thanksgiving dinner was about to walk into a corporate acquisition meeting on Monday morning, expecting to negotiate a raise. He had absolutely no idea who would be sitting at the head of that conference table. Me. That realization did not make me angry. It made me curious. Because when someone spends that much time performing wealth online, there is usually a gap between the image and the reality, and gaps are where interesting things hide. Thursday morning arrived quiet and gray. While the rest of the country worried about burnt turkey and awkward family conversations, I spent the holiday reviewing Apex Media financial disclosures. Around 4 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed. Instagram notification. Sienna was live streaming. Against my better judgment, I opened the video. She stood in a private dining room somewhere in Aspen, wearing a glittering dress and holding a champagne glass. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone! DeAndre surprised us with a luxury weekend getaway to celebrate his promotion. She flipped the camera toward the table. At the center sat a massive roasted turkey covered in shaved truffles. $400 turkey. Her voice practically purred. Some people are probably eating frozen dinners tonight while staring at spreadsheets, but we are living. My parents appeared behind her laughing loudly. Then DeAndre stepped into frame, wearing a $1,000 sweater, and kissed her cheek. The perfect influencer couple. I was about to close the video when something caught my eye. Behind Sienna, a hotel manager approached DeAndre with the bill. DeAndre reached into his wallet. He pulled out a sleek black metal card. Not American Express, not Chase. It had a geometric silver logo stamped in the corner. I froze. I knew that logo because I had spent the entire morning staring at it. It was the corporate card issued exclusively to Apex Media executives. I immediately opened the acquisition accounting portal, typed in his employee ID. The transaction ledger loaded slowly. Then, a charge appeared at the top of the screen. $6,800. St. Regis Aspen Resort. Category: Client Entertainment. I sat back and laughed softly because DeAndre had just done something incredibly useful. He had handed me the first piece of evidence, and I had a feeling it was not the only one. But what I discovered later that night would prove something far worse, and it would change everything about Monday morning. Monday morning arrived 3 days after Thanksgiving, at exactly 8:57 a.m. The executive boardroom on the 42nd floor of our headquarters overlooked the entire Chicago skyline. 29 leather chairs surrounded the long mahogany table. 30 folders sat perfectly aligned in front of them. Each folder contained the future of someone's career. My coffee was still steaming when I took my seat at the head of the table. I checked the time again. 3 minutes until the Apex Media executives arrived. 3 minutes until DeAndre Washington walked into the worst meeting of his life. If you have ever watched someone brag about success, only to learn they were standing on a house of cards, you already know what happens next. But the way it unfolded that morning surprised even me. The hallway outside the boardroom began filling with voices. I could hear nervous laughter, the shuffling of expensive shoes, and one voice, louder than all the others. DeAndre. Listen, guys, he said confidently. These corporate takeover types always try to scare management into accepting cuts. But we are the ones who control the accounts. They need us. I'm walking in there and demanding a 20% salary increase. A few people laughed nervously. Another voice asked, "You think they will actually agree to that?" DeAndre scoffed. "They will if they want results." That was when the glass doors opened. 20 executives stepped into the room. Some looked anxious, some looked defensive, but DeAndre walked in like he owned the building. Tailored navy suit, gold watch, designer coffee cup in his hand. His eyes scanned the room casually until they landed on me. He stopped walking. For a split second, confusion crossed his face. Then the smirk returned. "Nadia?" He laughed loudly. The sound echoed off the walls. "What are you doing here?" He looked around the room, inviting the others to share the joke. "Did you get lost on the way to the accounting department?" A few executives chuckled awkwardly. They did not know me yet, but they could sense the tension. DeAndre walked toward the center of the table and leaned forward with both hands planted on the wood. "Seriously, though," he continued, "I knew you worked in finance somewhere in Chicago, but I did not realize you were a secretary for the holding company. Are you taking notes for this meeting? Or did they send you to audit petty cash?" More laughter. He turned slightly toward the others. "This is my sister-in-law. Family embarrassment. Always bitter because she works all the time and nobody wants to marry her." Then he pointed toward the side of the room. "Actually, do me a favor, Nadia. Grab me a sparkling water. I want to stay hydrated while I negotiate my new compensation package." I did not respond. I simply watched him. Silence is a powerful tool in business. The room slowly grew uncomfortable. The chief financial officer of Apex Media, a man named Harold Bishop, shifted in his chair. He noticed my tailored blazer. He noticed the acquisition binder in front of me. Most importantly, he noticed where I was sitting, at the head of the table. DeAndre finally stopped talking. "What?" he snapped. "Why is everyone staring?" I slowly stood up. The chair moved back with a quiet scrape across the floor. Then I picked up the small remote control resting beside my coffee. Click. The automatic blinds dropped over the floor-to-ceiling windows. The room darkened instantly. Click. The presentation screen behind me lit up. A massive organizational chart filled the wall. At the very top sat a single photograph. My photograph. Under it were the words, Senior Vice President of Acquisitions Integration. Below that title stretched dozens of lines representing every department in Apex Media, and one line extended directly downward to a single name highlighted in red. DeAndre Washington, Regional Vice President. The silence was absolute. DeAndre stared at the screen. His coffee cup slipped from his hand. It shattered on the marble floor. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then he laughed again, but this laugh sounded different. High-pitched, forced. "Okay, very funny." He waved his hand toward the screen. "You hacked their presentation system. Great prank. Did my father-in-law help you set this up? Because this is a little extreme just because we skipped Thanksgiving." I ignored him. "Please open the folders in front of you." My voice was calm, professional. Every executive slowly reached for the black binders, except DeAndre. He crossed his arms instead. "You think you are funny?" he said. "You really expect me to believe you run this acquisition?" I opened my binder. Page 1 displayed the signed purchase agreement for Apex Media. Page 2 displayed the executive restructuring plan. Page 3 listed immediate termination candidates. 42 names. DeAndre Washington was number 12. "Mr. Washington," I said quietly, "you may want to sit down." The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone coughed. DeAndre looked around the table again. Nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody was smiling. Harold Bishop slowly lowered his eyes. Then DeAndre finally sat. "Good," I continued. "Now that we have everyone's attention, we can begin the restructuring review." I clicked the remote again. A spreadsheet appeared on the screen. Expense reports, dates, transaction amounts. Highlighted in yellow were several purchases from the previous weekend. $6,800. St. Regis Aspen Resort. Client entertainment. Another charge appeared below. $2,100. Luxury spa package. Client entertainment. Another, $4,900. Designer retail store. Client entertainment. DeAndre leaned forward slowly. "What is this supposed to mean?" "It means," I said calmly, "that your expense account shows more luxury purchases than actual client meetings." I flipped a page inside the binder. The executives around the table did the same. "This is a preliminary audit of your department's corporate card activity. Over $50,000 in questionable charges, many of which occurred at locations where no Apex Media clients were present." DeAndre slammed his hand on the table. "This is harassment," he shouted. "You cannot just pull my financial records without approval." I looked up at him. "I already did." I slid a document across the table. Signed authorization from the holding company board, allowing immediate financial review of all Apex Media leadership. DeAndre stared at the paper. The color slowly drained from his face, then anger replaced it. "You are doing this because you are jealous," he pointed directly at me. "You are a bitter woman who cannot stand seeing her sister married to someone successful. This entire meeting is a personal vendetta." One of the executives whispered, "Oh my God." Another shifted his chair farther away from DeAndre, but I simply closed the binder. "Actually," I said quietly, "this meeting has nothing to do with jealousy. It has to do with theft." The room froze again. DeAndre leaned back slowly. "What did you just say?" I pressed another button on the remote. A new document appeared on the screen. Wire transfer records, bank routing numbers, shell company payments. Company name, SW Consulting, LLC. Registered owner, Sienna, Washington. My sister. That was the moment the entire room realized this situation was far worse than anyone expected. And DeAndre had absolutely no idea how much evidence I was about to show them. But the next thing he did shocked everyone in the room, because instead of denying it, he smiled. The moment DeAndre saw his wife's name on the screen, something strange happened. He smiled. Not nervously, not defensively, confidently. That was the moment I realized something very important about him. People who lie for a living eventually begin believing their own stories. He leaned back in his chair slowly and folded his hands like a man who had just been accused of something trivial. "Is that supposed to scare me?" His voice carried across the boardroom with surprising calm. "You found a marketing consultant. Congratulations. Companies hire consultants all the time." I heard someone across the table shift uncomfortably. Another executive flipped through the binder pages again. But DeAndre kept smiling. "You want to audit my department? Fine. You want to embarrass me in front of my colleagues because you are upset about Thanksgiving? Also fine. But let me explain something to everyone in this room." He stood up and walked slowly toward the screen. "That company," he pointed directly at the name SW Consulting, LLC, "is a legitimate marketing vendor. My wife happens to own it. So what? Plenty of executives outsource work to outside consultants. This is completely legal." He turned toward the room. "Look around. Half of you probably do the exact same thing." No one answered, because no one wanted to be associated with him anymore. But DeAndre interpreted the silence differently. He thought it meant agreement. He walked back toward the table. "You tried to make it look like fraud, but this is business, and unless you can prove those services were fake, this entire little presentation of yours is just harassment." He sat down again, completely relaxed. I studied his face carefully. Most criminals panic when confronted with evidence, but DeAndre believed he had covered his tracks. And in a way, he had. The invoices existed. The payments were documented. On the surface, everything looked legitimate, which meant he thought the worst was already over. But he did not realize something crucial. This was only the first layer. I tapped the remote again. The screen changed. Now it showed something different. Dates, IP addresses, email timestamps, server login records. DeAndre frowned slightly. "What is that supposed to be?" "That," I said calmly, "is the internal server activity connected to those consulting invoices." He shifted in his chair. "Meaning?" "Meaning," I continued, "every invoice submitted by SW Consulting was uploaded through the Apex Media vendor portal, and every one of those uploads came from the exact same IP address, the same computer, inside your office." The room became very quiet again. DeAndre's smile faded slightly. "You are reaching," he said. "Consultants sometimes work directly with management. Maybe my assistant uploaded them." I nodded slowly. "That is a reasonable explanation. Except," I clicked the remote again, Another document appeared. Employee login credentials. Your assistant was on vacation during 3 of those submissions. The uploads came from your employee ID. The CFO, Harold Bishop, suddenly leaned forward. Are you saying he created the invoices himself? I did not answer right away. Instead, I opened my binder again. Inside was the full forensic audit summary, because the real story was still buried deeper. You see, consulting fraud works like this. A fake company submits an invoice, an executive approves it, the company pays the invoice, the money disappears. But someone made a very interesting mistake. The shell company bank account was not completely separate from personal finances. The routing numbers told a different story. I pressed the remote again. Another page appeared. Wire transfers, deposits, account names. And then the final column. Outgoing transfers. Luxury retail stores, private resort payments, credit card balances. All connected to Sienna Washington's personal accounts. The room exploded with whispers. Harold Bishop's voice cut through the noise. My God, that money went straight into her personal account. DeAndre stood up suddenly. That is speculation. His voice was louder now, less confident. You cannot prove that money came from Apex funds. I leaned forward slightly. Actually, I said quietly, we can. Because the federal banking system keeps transaction records. Every wire transfer leaves a trail, and those trails match perfectly with the exact dates of your consulting invoices. He stared at the screen. For the first time, real fear flickered across his face. But pride still kept him standing. This is still corporate politics, he said. You are twisting numbers to make it look worse than it is. You want my job. That is all this is. I closed my binder slowly. Mr. Washington, your job ended 15 minutes ago. I slid another document across the table. Termination authorization, signed by the holding company board. But that was not the document that truly mattered, because sitting underneath it was something much more dangerous. The official fraud referral request to the federal authorities. DeAndre looked down at the paper. His hands trembled slightly. You cannot send this to the government, he whispered. It was the first time his voice sounded small. The boardroom remained silent. Everyone understood what that document meant. Corporate misconduct could be handled internally, but wire fraud across state lines became a federal crime. And federal crimes did not end with termination. They ended with indictments. I stood up slowly. You used corporate funds to pay a shell company. You approved those payments yourself. You routed the money into a personal account owned by your wife, and you used that money for personal luxury purchases. That is not poor accounting. That is embezzlement. The room felt like ice. DeAndre looked around the table desperately, but no one met his eyes. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of shouting again, instead of denying everything, he laughed. A quiet laugh. You really think you have won, he said softly. Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out something that made the entire room go silent again. Because whatever he had just placed on the table was aimed directly at me. And suddenly the situation was no longer just about him. DeAndre slowly slid the document across the table toward me. His smile had returned. Not the loud, arrogant smile he wore earlier. This one was quieter, more dangerous. You should read that before you accuse me of anything else. His voice had dropped into something almost calm. I did not touch the paper immediately. In negotiations, hesitation is a language. DeAndre leaned back in his chair again. Go ahead, Nadia, since you enjoy exposing people so much. Let everyone see what happens when your own secrets come out. Several executives leaned forward nervously. Harold Bishop adjusted his glasses. I finally picked up the document. At first glance, it looked like a printed email thread, 3 pages. My name appeared in the subject line. The sender was listed as an anonymous whistleblower account. The message claimed something very specific. Senior Vice President Nadia Carter manipulated the Apex Media acquisition in order to target a family member. Conflict of interest, corporate retaliation, personal vendetta. Attached below the email were screenshots, bank records, property documents. My name appeared again. DeAndre watched my face carefully, trying to measure my reaction. For a moment, the room waited. Then he spoke again. "You see," he said calmly, "you forgot one important rule about corporate politics. Never attack someone who has nothing left to lose." The executives around the table shifted uncomfortably. DeAndre pointed toward the screen. "You claim I misused company funds. Maybe. But your company just appointed you to oversee an acquisition involving your own brother-in-law." He looked directly at Harold Bishop. "That is a textbook conflict of interest, is it not?" Harold did not answer, but his silence told me exactly what DeAndre wanted. Doubt. Because in corporate environments, perception can be as dangerous as truth. DeAndre continued, "And if the board discovers you targeted my position because of a family dispute, your entire investigation becomes invalid." He tapped the table. "Which means everything you just accused me of disappears." He turned toward the other executives. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we are watching right now is not an audit. It is revenge." A quiet murmur spread through the room. Someone whispered, "Is that possible?" Another voice answered quietly, "Technically, yes." DeAndre leaned forward again. "If Nadia Carter continues this accusation, I will release this information to the press. Corporate media loves stories about executive abuse of power, especially when family drama is involved." Then he turned back to me. "Your promotion disappears, your reputation disappears, and this acquisition becomes a legal disaster." He paused, then delivered the line he clearly rehearsed. "So, Nadia, what happens next is your choice." For several seconds, I said nothing. DeAndre believed he had forced a stalemate. He believed the threat of scandal would make me retreat. But there was something he had not realized. The document he handed me revealed something far more interesting than a threat. It revealed his strategy. And that strategy had a fatal flaw. I placed the papers back on the table. Then I looked around the boardroom slowly. Does anyone here believe this investigation started because of a family argument? No one answered, but the tension was obvious. Corporate executives survive by avoiding risk, and DeAndre had just created uncertainty. So I decided to remove it completely. I pressed the remote again. The screen behind me changed. Now it showed something entirely new: security footage. The image displayed a luxury resort dining room. Date, Thanksgiving evening. Location, St. Regis, Aspen. The executives leaned forward. DeAndre's eyes narrowed. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly. I ignored him. The video began playing. The room watched silently as Sienna streamed her Instagram broadcast. Champagne, the expensive turkey, my parents laughing, DeAndre bragging. But the part that mattered came a few seconds later. The hotel manager approached with the bill. DeAndre reached into his wallet, pulled out the black corporate card, and handed it over. The camera zoomed slightly. The silver Apex Media logo was clearly visible. $6,800, charged directly to the company. The room went silent again. Harold Bishop leaned forward slowly. "You used company funds for a personal holiday dinner." DeAndre opened his mouth, but I spoke first. Actually, that was only the beginning. I clicked the remote again. Now the screen displayed a much longer list: luxury hotels, designer boutiques, car rentals, private spa treatments, all charged to the same corporate account. Total, $53,000 in just 8 months. Several executives looked physically uncomfortable now, but DeAndre still refused to surrender. "Client entertainment," he said quickly. Every one of those charges involved business relationships. Then I opened the final folder. Inside was the document that changed everything. I slid copies across the table. Bank transfer records, routing numbers, Federal Financial Tracking Logs. Harold Bishop read the page, then his face went pale. "These transfers," he whispered. "They came directly from the consulting company account." "Yes," I said quietly.
"And where did that consulting company send the money next?"
He flipped the page. His hand froze. The answer was printed clearly. Mortgage payments for the Washington residence, Sienna and DeAndre's house. Suddenly, the entire boardroom understood. The fake consulting company had not just funded luxury purchases, it had funded their house. DeAndre stood up so quickly his chair fell over. "You cannot prove that," he shouted. "That is circumstantial. That is manipulation." I looked directly at him. Then I spoke the sentence that changed the atmosphere of the room forever. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation already confirmed the transfers this morning." Silence. Absolute silence. Even DeAndre stopped moving. Because now, this was no longer corporate discipline. This was a federal crime. And the worst part for him was this. The FBI was not investigating because of the Thanksgiving dinner. They had started looking into Apex Media months earlier, which meant something much larger was hiding behind the fraud. Something DeAndre had not told anyone, including Sienna. And when that truth came out, it would destroy far more than his career. But none of us knew yet just how dangerous that secret really was. And the next person who walked into that boardroom was about to reveal it. The boardroom door opened at exactly 9:41 a.m. No one in the room had touched their coffee. No one had spoken since I mentioned the FBI. DeAndre was still standing beside his overturned chair. His hands were clenched so tightly, the knuckles had turned white. When the door opened, every head turned. A man in a dark navy suit stepped inside. Mid-40s, sharp posture, leather briefcase. Behind him stood the vice president of corporate compliance from our company. And two individuals I recognized immediately. Federal investigators. They did not wear uniforms, but the badges clipped discreetly inside their jackets made their authority unmistakable. The lead investigator walked calmly to the end of the table. He placed a small folder down. Then he looked directly at me. "Ms. Carter, thank you for inviting us." His voice was measured, professional, but the effect on the room was immediate. One of the Apex executives whispered under his breath, "Oh my God." DeAndre's breathing became noticeably louder. "You called the FBI?" he said slowly. I folded my hands on the table. "Actually, they contacted us first." The investigator nodded slightly. "That is correct." He opened his folder. "Apex Media has been under preliminary review for 6 months due to irregular vendor payments. Specifically, the consulting firm known as SW Consulting LLC. DeAndre let out a short laugh. "This is ridiculous. That is a legitimate vendor." The investigator did not even look at him. "We know it is not legitimate." Silence again. The investigator slid several documents onto the table. Bank transfers, email transcripts, server activity logs. "We have already confirmed that the consulting company is a shell entity created solely to route corporate funds into personal accounts." DeAndre's jaw tightened. But that was not the part that froze the room. The investigator continued. "However, the consulting invoices represent only a portion of the financial irregularities tied to your account." Harold Bishop looked up. "What do you mean, portion?" The investigator turned the page. "Because the consulting payments total approximately $120,000. But the suspicious financial activity linked to Mr. Washington exceeds $600,000. Every person in the room went completely still. Even I had not expected that number. $600,000? Harold repeated quietly. DeAndre shook his head immediately. "That is impossible." The investigator pushed another document forward. "These are vendor kickback payments, tied to advertising contracts awarded by your department. 14 vendors, over 2 years. Each contract approval was followed by a payment into an account controlled by your wife's company." The room erupted into whispers. One executive leaned back in his chair like someone had just punched him in the stomach. Another muttered, "This cannot be real." DeAndre slammed both hands onto the table. "This is fabricated," he pointed at me.
She is feeding you this. This entire thing is a setup.
The investigator finally looked at him directly. "Mr. Washington, the investigation began long before Ms. Carter became involved in the Apex acquisition. Your digital activity and financial transfers triggered automated banking alerts through the federal fraud monitoring system." DeAndre stopped speaking, because in that moment, he understood something devastating. This was not Nadia exposing him. The system had already exposed him. I watched the realization settle into his face slowly. The confidence disappeared first, then the anger, then the last thin layer of denial. But pride still refused to let him collapse. "You cannot prove I personally authorized any of those transfers," he said. The investigator nodded. "That was our initial challenge." He opened another folder. "But then something unexpected happened 2 nights ago. We received security footage from a Chicago parking garage." My stomach tightened slightly. I knew exactly what footage he meant. The investigator placed a tablet on the table. The video began playing. A dim underground garage, Apex Media headquarters. And then the image everyone recognized. DeAndre, standing beside a car, holding a tablet, threatening someone. My Tesla camera recording everything. His voice echoed clearly through the boardroom speakers. "If you do not delete those files tonight, I will destroy your career." Several executives gasped. The investigator paused the video. Mr. Washington attempted to bribe a corporate auditor to destroy financial evidence. He also attempted extortion against a senior executive. Both actions constitute additional federal offenses. DeAndre stared at the screen like he was watching someone else. Because in a way, he was. The version of himself who believed he could talk his way out of anything. The investigator closed the tablet. "At this time, we are not placing you under arrest. However, a federal grand jury has issued subpoenas for all related financial records, and we strongly recommend you retain legal counsel immediately." The room remained silent. The investigators gathered their files, then they left. Just like that. No shouting, no handcuffs. But the damage had already been done, because the moment the door closed, the Apex executives began distancing themselves, literally. Chairs slid backward. People leaned away from DeAndre. No one wanted to be sitting near the center of a federal fraud investigation. DeAndre slowly sat down. His hands trembled slightly. For the first time since I had known him, he looked small. But what happened next surprised everyone again. Instead of begging, instead of apologizing, he turned his head slowly and looked directly at me, and smiled. A strange, almost relieved smile. "You think this ends with me," he said quietly. Then he leaned closer. "But Nadia, you have no idea how deep this actually goes." The room went still again, because suddenly it sounded like DeAndre was not just warning me. He was warning everyone. And if he was telling the truth, then Apex Media was hiding something far bigger than a corrupt executive. Something that might bring the entire company down. And the next thing he said confirmed it. "There are people above me. Much higher." For several seconds after DeAndre spoke, no one in the room moved. "There are people above me. Much higher." The words hung in the air like smoke. Most criminals try to minimize their involvement. But DeAndre had just done the opposite. He had expanded the battlefield. Harold Bishop was the first to react. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" His voice was tense. DeAndre leaned back slowly. For the first time that morning, he did not look panicked. He looked relieved. "You think I built that vendor network by myself?" He laughed quietly. "You think a regional vice president can move $600,000 through 14 contracts without anyone noticing?" Several executives exchanged uneasy looks, because the uncomfortable truth was obvious. Large corporate fraud almost never involves only one person. Someone always signs the approvals. Someone always looks the other way. The question was who? Harold's voice hardened. "If you are suggesting other executives were involved, You need to say that clearly. DeAndre shrugged. I am saying exactly what I already said. There are people above me. His eyes moved slowly across the table. Then they landed on me again. And they helped me. The implication hit the room instantly. Someone near the top of Apex Media had allowed this to happen. Maybe even benefited from it. I spoke for the first time since the investigators left. If you have evidence of that, this is the moment to present it. DeAndre tilted his head slightly. You really want to open that door? His voice was almost amused. Because if I start talking, Nadia, things might get very uncomfortable for your company, too. The statement was clearly a threat, not just toward me, toward the holding company that had just purchased Apex Media. Harold Bishop slammed his palm on the table. Enough! If you are trying to bargain your way out of this situation, you should know something. Corporate fraud investigations do not end because someone makes vague accusations. DeAndre smiled faintly. You are right, which is why I am not making accusations. He reached down slowly and picked up his briefcase. Inside was a slim black folder. He placed it on the table. Then he opened it. Several printed documents slid out. Contracts, emails, payment authorizations. I immediately recognized the formatting. These were internal Apex Media approvals. But the signatures at the bottom were not DeAndre's. Harold leaned forward to read them. His expression shifted from irritation to confusion. These are vendor authorization forms. Correct, DeAndre replied. Now look at the approval signatures. Harold flipped to the first page, then the second, then the third. Every document had two signatures, DeAndre Washington and someone else. The second name appeared repeatedly, Robert Ellison. The room reacted instantly. Someone whispered, the chief operating officer. Robert Ellison was not in that boardroom because he had been traveling for acquisition negotiations the previous week. He was Apex Media's second highest executive. Harold looked stunned. You are claiming the COO approved these contracts? DeAndre did not answer immediately. Instead, he pointed to the signature line again. That looks like his handwriting to me. The tension in the room changed again. This was no longer a simple embezzlement case. If the COO had approved those vendor payments, the scandal moved far higher up the corporate ladder. And that meant something else. Our holding company had just purchased an organization with a massive internal corruption problem. Harold rubbed his forehead slowly. We will verify these signatures. DeAndre leaned back. Please do, but make sure you check the dates carefully. Harold flipped another page. The dates spanned almost 2 years, which meant the fraud had existed long before the acquisition. I studied DeAndre carefully. Something about his posture had changed. He no longer looked like someone trying to escape punishment. He looked like someone who had already accepted it. And that made him dangerous. Tell me something, DeAndre, I said calmly. Why reveal this now? You could have stayed silent, taken the charges, protected everyone else involved. He looked at me for several seconds. Then he laughed quietly. Because everyone else already abandoned me. His eyes shifted toward the empty doorway. You saw how fast they disappeared once the FBI mentioned subpoenas. He tapped the folder. So, if I am going down, I am not going alone. The words were cold, controlled, almost rational, and that was the most dangerous kind of revenge. Harold stood up. This meeting is over. All financial records from Apex Media are now frozen pending full investigation. No executive here is authorized to access internal systems until compliance completes a full audit. He looked directly at DeAndre. Security will escort you out of the building. DeAndre stood slowly. He picked up his briefcase. But before leaving, he turned toward me one last time. You really should thank me, Nadia. His voice dropped to a whisper only I could hear. Because if I had not started this mess, you would have never discovered what your company just bought. Then he walked toward the door. Security was already waiting in the hallway. The door closed behind him. The boardroom sat in silence for almost a full minute. Finally, Harold exhaled slowly. This acquisition just became a nightmare. But my mind was not on the acquisition anymore. It was on something DeAndre had said earlier. There are people above me, much higher. If Robert Ellison had truly approved those contracts, then this fraud was not just DeAndre's operation. And that meant one thing. The most powerful person inside Apex Media had not yet spoken. But within 48 hours, that person would. And when they did, the story would take a turn none of us were prepared for. The boardroom slowly emptied after DeAndre was escorted out. Executives left in silence. No small talk, no eye contact. Just the quiet understanding that the company they had walked into that morning no longer existed in the same form. Corporate scandals have a very specific atmosphere. The air feels heavier. People start calculating survival. By the time the room cleared, only 3 of us remained. Harold Bishop, the vice president of compliance, and me. Harold loosened his tie and stared at the stack of documents DeAndre had left behind. "If even half of this is real," he said quietly, "we are looking at the largest internal fraud case Apex Media has ever had." The compliance officer nodded, and the holding company will want answers immediately. That meant the board of directors, and the board does not tolerate surprises, especially not federal investigations. Harold looked toward me. "Nadia, you were brought in to restructure the company, but now you are standing in the middle of a criminal investigation involving senior leadership." He paused, "including the chief operating officer, Robert Ellison." I nodded. "I am aware." The compliance officer gathered the documents carefully. "We will begin verifying these signatures immediately. Until then, no one outside this room needs to know DeAndre made that accusation." Harold frowned. "You think he fabricated it?" "Possibly," the compliance officer replied. "But if he did not, then we are dealing with something far bigger than one executive stealing money. We are dealing with systemic corruption." That word settled into the room slowly. Systemic, which meant years of deception, years of financial manipulation, years of people pretending not to notice. Harold stood. "I need to contact the board." But before he left, he looked at me again. "You should prepare yourself." "Why?" "Because if Robert Ellison is involved, the press will frame this as a catastrophic acquisition failure. And guess who led the acquisition?" His meaning was clear. Me. Corporate success always belongs to the company, but corporate failure belongs to the person in charge. After Harold and compliance left, the boardroom finally fell silent. I sat alone for a long time, looking out across the city skyline. Then I did something unexpected. I closed my laptop, because for the first time since the investigation began, I needed to think. Not as an executive, but as a strategist. DeAndre had revealed Robert Ellison's name, but something about the timing felt wrong. If Ellison truly approved the fraudulent contracts, DeAndre could have exposed him months ago. Why wait until the exact moment he was caught? Which meant one of 2 things. Either DeAndre was lying, or Ellison had betrayed him. Both possibilities were dangerous, but the second possibility was worse. Because people who feel betrayed often decide to burn everything down. That afternoon, the entire executive floor moved like a hospital waiting room. Phones rang constantly. Lawyers arrived. Compliance teams began auditing every financial system. By evening, the building was nearly empty. Most executives had gone home, but I stayed, because there was one more place I needed to check. The Apex Media internal server archive. At 8:12 p.m., the office lights dimmed automatically as the building switched to night mode. The hallways were quiet. My heels echoed across the marble floor as I walked toward the secure data office. Inside, the server terminals hummed softly. I logged into the acquisition audit portal. Then I began reviewing the vendor contracts DeAndre had flagged. 14 vendors, 2 years of transactions. Each contract had 2 signatures. DeAndre Washington, Robert Ellison, at least on paper. But signatures are easy to fake. Metadata is not. I opened the document history for the first contract. Every corporate document carries digital fingerprints. Creation time, modification history, login credentials, IP addresses. The information appeared on the screen. Creator, DeAndre Washington. Editor, DeAndre Washington. Approver, Robert Ellison. But something caught my attention: the approval timestamp. Every contract showed Ellison approving the payment within minutes of submission, sometimes within 30 seconds, which meant something very strange. Because senior executives do not approve six-figure vendor contracts in 30 seconds. They review them, they ask questions, they delegate. No executive signs 14 major contracts blindly, unless they were never the ones actually approving them. I leaned closer to the screen. Then I checked the login data attached to Ellison's approvals. My pulse slowed slightly, because the login location was not what I expected. It was not Ellison's office. It was not his corporate laptop. It was the same internal workstation, DeAndre's office terminal. I sat back slowly and smiled, because suddenly everything made sense. DeAndre had not only created the fake invoices, he had forged the approvals, using Ellison's login credentials, which meant the COO might not even know his name was attached to the fraud. And if that was true, then DeAndre had just made a very dangerous mistake. He had tried to drag a powerful executive into the investigation, a powerful executive who would not appreciate being framed. I closed the file, because at that exact moment, my phone vibrated on the desk. Unknown number. I answered. Ms. Carter. The voice was calm, controlled. This is Robert Ellison, Chief Operating Officer of Apex Media. I froze for half a second, because Ellison was supposed to be traveling, but his next sentence explained everything. I just heard something very interesting about my name appearing in a fraud investigation, and I think you and I need to talk immediately. There was a pause. Then he added something that made the entire situation far more dangerous, because the person who set this whole thing in motion is still inside your building tonight. For a moment after Robert Ellison finished speaking, I did not answer. The quiet hum of the server room filled the space around me. The person who set this whole thing in motion is still inside your building tonight. His words replayed in my head. Mr. Ellison, I said calmly, you are currently traveling according to the company's schedule. There was a short pause on the line. Then he replied, I was, but my flight landed in Chicago an hour ago, and I came directly to the office. My eyes moved toward the glass wall of the server room. The executive floor was nearly empty. Only a few hallway lights were still on. Where are you now? I asked. Parking garage. His voice was steady. Security let me in 10 minutes ago. I'm heading upstairs. He paused again. But before I walk into that building, I want to understand exactly what my name is doing in those documents. Fair enough, I replied. Then I told him the truth. Your signature appears on 14 vendor contracts connected to the consulting firm under investigation. Another pause, longer this time. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed. Lower, sharper. That is impossible. That was my conclusion as well, I said, because the approval timestamps on those contracts are impossible. Explain. Each document shows approval within seconds of submission, from the same internal workstation, DeAndre's office. The silence on the phone stretched for several seconds. Then Ellison said something quietly. That son of a bitch. You believe the signatures were forged. Not forged, I said. Stolen. His login credentials were likely compromised. That meant DeAndre had something far more valuable than a fake consulting company. He had access to executive approval authority, which meant every contract looked legitimate. Ellison exhaled slowly. How many contracts? 14, over 2 years. Estimated fraud exceeding 600,000. Another pause. Then Ellison spoke again. I am coming upstairs. We need to verify this immediately. 10 minutes later, I heard the elevator open down the hallway. The footsteps were steady, measured. Robert Ellison entered the server room, wearing a dark overcoat and carrying a leather briefcase. He was older than DeAndre, mid-50s, gray at the temples, the kind of executive who had spent decades navigating corporate wars. He did not waste time with introductions. "Show me." I turned the monitor toward him. He reviewed the contracts quickly, then opened the metadata logs. His expression hardened. "That is my login," he said quietly. "But the IP address is not my office." "Exactly," I replied. He continued scrolling. Each approval happened within seconds. Same terminal, same timestamp pattern. Then he looked up at me. "You realize what this means?" "Yes," I said. "It means DeAndre framed you." Ellison nodded slowly, but something about his reaction seemed off. Not surprise, more like confirmation. "You suspected him before today," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, then he answered honestly, "Yes." "How long?" "Months." I raised an eyebrow. "You suspected a $600,000 fraud scheme and did nothing?" Ellison closed the laptop. "I suspected something smaller. Expense manipulation, vendor favoritism. Not this." Then he looked toward the dark hallway outside the server room. But once the acquisition was announced, he knew his time was limited. So he accelerated the operation, meaning the Aspen charges. "Yes," Ellison said. "That was reckless. He must have panicked." Then he looked back at me. "But that is not the interesting part." I crossed my arms. "What is?" Ellison leaned forward slightly. "You said he tried to drag me into the investigation." "Yes," which means he expected to be caught eventually. He opened his briefcase. Inside were several printed reports, but he needed a backup plan. And his backup plan was to make sure he was not the only one falling. He placed the reports on the table. "These are Apex Media vendor access logs. I reviewed them earlier this week, before the acquisition closed." I glanced down. The logs showed dozens of vendor portal logins, different accounts, different departments, but something about the pattern looked familiar. Then I saw it. The same consulting firm name appearing across multiple divisions. SW Consulting LLC. Not just DeAndre's department. 3 other departments. Ellison watched my reaction carefully. "Now you see it." DeAndre was not the only executive using that vendor. The room went silent again, because suddenly the fraud looked much larger. 3 departments, multiple approvals, hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more, which meant something else. DeAndre may have created the system, but other people had started using it. Ellison spoke again. "Fraud spreads inside companies the same way mold spreads inside walls, quietly, until the structure is already rotting." I studied the reports. 4 departments. Total suspicious payments, $980,000. Nearly $1 million. Then a thought crossed my mind. Did the FBI see these logs? Ellison shook his head. "Not yet. They are still focused on DeAndre's transactions." "Meaning," I said slowly. "They think this is a single executive fraud case." "Exactly," Ellison replied. "But if these records are real, this becomes corporate conspiracy, which changes everything." I leaned back in my chair, because now the stakes were much higher. One corrupt executive could be contained, but a conspiracy involving multiple departments? That could destroy Apex Media entirely, and possibly damage the holding company that just bought it. Ellison looked at me carefully. "You realize the board will have 2 choices now." I knew exactly what he meant. Either expose the full investigation or quietly contain it. Corporate reputations are worth billions, and reputations do not survive public scandals easily. Ellison continued. "The board will meet tomorrow morning, and they will ask a very simple question. Do we burn the entire house down or remove only the most obvious fire?" "Meaning DeAndre." "Meaning DeAndre," Ellison confirmed. "But I am more interested in something else." He tapped the vendor logs again. "Someone else is still using this system, even after DeAndre was exposed." I looked down again. He was right. There was one transaction from earlier that day, $5,000, submitted just 4 hours ago, which meant something chilling. Whoever else was involved did not know the investigation had started, or they were desperate enough to keep going anyway. Ellison looked directly at me. If we follow that transaction, we find the next person involved. I nodded slowly. And if that person realizes the system is collapsing, they might try to erase everything. Or run. Ellison closed the laptop. Then we need to move fast, because if we are right, the real architect of this fraud network has not revealed themselves yet. The timestamp on the latest transaction read 4:17 p.m. Only 4 hours earlier. $5,000. SW Consulting LLC, submitted through the vendor portal, which meant someone inside Apex Media had just approved another payment. Even after the investigation started, even after the FBI visited the building, even after DeAndre was escorted out, either they had no idea what was happening, or they were desperate enough to keep going anyway. Robert Ellison studied the screen quietly. Whoever did this used a department login. Which department? I zoomed into the metadata. Marketing Strategy Division. Ellison frowned. That department does not report to DeAndre. Exactly, I said, which means the fraud system spread beyond his control. We both understood the implication. This was no longer one criminal exploiting a loophole. It was a system that other executives had started using. Quietly. Ellison folded his arms. Who runs marketing strategy? I pulled up the organizational chart. Vice President, Daniel Mercer. Ellison nodded slowly. Mercer. That name clearly meant something to him. You know him well, I said. Too well, Ellison replied. He has been with Apex 15 years, ambitious, aggressively political, and very good at protecting himself. I scrolled through the transaction record again. The approval came from Mercer's department login, but the workstation location was different. Office tower, floor 38, which meant someone was still in the building right now. Ellison looked toward the hallway. It was nearly 9:30. Most employees had already gone home. But someone on the 38th floor had just approved a payment linked to a federal fraud investigation. If that person realized the system was collapsing, they might try to delete records. Or worse. Ellison closed the laptop. Let us find out. We left the server room and walked quickly down the silent hallway. The elevators opened with a soft chime. The ride down to the 38th floor felt longer than usual. Neither of us spoke, because we were both thinking the same thing. If Mercer was involved, confronting him tonight would force a reaction, and reactions reveal everything. The elevator doors opened. The marketing strategy floor was dimly lit. Most lights were off. Rows of cubicles sat empty, computer monitors dark. But one office near the corner still had the lights on. Ellison stopped walking. Mercer's office. I glanced through the glass wall. Inside, Daniel Mercer sat at his desk, laptop open, phone pressed against his ear. He looked tense. Very tense. Ellison pushed the door open without knocking. Mercer looked up immediately. For a split second, his face showed pure shock. Robert? He stood up quickly. And, Nadia, what are you doing here? Ellison did not answer the question. He walked straight to the desk. You approved a vendor payment 4 hours ago. Mercer blinked. What payment? Ellison placed the printed log on the desk. SW Consulting, LLC. $5,000. Mercer stared at the paper, then looked back up. That is impossible. That vendor is part of DeAndre's department, not mine. The login came from your division portal. Mercer shook his head immediately. I did not approve anything today. His denial sounded genuine, but something about his body language changed. Not guilt, recognition. You have heard of that company before, I said quietly. Mercer hesitated, then nodded. Yes. DeAndre introduced them months ago. He said they handled digital marketing analytics. Did you ever meet them? No, everything was handled through invoices. Ellison stepped closer. How many times did your department use them? Mercer thought for a moment. 3 contracts, maybe 4. Ellison and I exchanged a look. The same pattern. Multiple departments using the same fake vendor. Mercer suddenly realized something. Wait, he said slowly. You are not here about a $5,000 payment. You are investigating DeAndre. Yes, Ellison replied. Mercer leaned back in his chair. Then his expression shifted from confusion to something else. Concern. How bad is it? Ellison did not soften the answer. Federal investigation. Wire fraud. Nearly $1 million in suspicious transactions. Mercer's face went pale. 1 million? He whispered. Then he looked down at the transaction log again. That means he stopped speaking. Because suddenly he understood something. My department was not the only one using that vendor. No, I said. 4 departments so far. Mercer ran a hand through his hair. This is insane. DeAndre must have built that system years ago. And once it existed, other people used it, quietly. Mercer looked at both of us carefully. You think someone else is still running the scheme? Ellison answered bluntly, yes. And whoever approved that payment today is either very stupid or very confident they will never be caught. Mercer turned his laptop toward us. Let me check something. He logged into the internal system quickly, then opened the vendor approval history. His eyes moved across the screen. Then he froze. Oh, no. Ellison leaned closer. What? Mercer turned the screen around. The approval for the $5,000 payment was visible, but the name attached to the login was not his. It was someone else from the department, director level. Name, Laura Chen. I recognized it immediately. Director of Strategic Partnerships. Mercer exhaled slowly. Laura handles most of the vendor relationships, but she left the office hours ago. Ellison looked toward the empty hallway. Are you sure? Mercer nodded. She said she had a late dinner meeting tonight. Then Mercer frowned again. Unless... Unless what? Unless she came back. We all looked toward the silent corridor, because if Laura Chen had returned to approve that payment, there was only one reason. She was trying to move money before the system shut down. And if she realized we were closing in, she might try to disappear. But at that exact moment, Mercer's laptop chimed. A new email notification appeared on the screen. Subject line, Vendor Payout Confirmation. Sender, SW Consulting, LLC. But the message inside contained something none of us expected. Because the payment had not gone to DeAndre's shell company. It had been redirected to a completely different bank account. And the name on that account was not Laura Chen. For a moment, no one in the room spoke. The confirmation email remained open on Mercer's laptop. $5,000, approved at 4:17 p.m., redirected to a different bank account. The account holder name appeared clearly on the screen. Global Insight Holdings, LLC. Mercer frowned. That is not the consulting company. No, I said quietly. It is not. Ellison leaned closer to the screen. Open the account details. Mercer clicked the link. The vendor profile expanded. Company registration, payment routing, owner information. And then the name appeared. Laura Chen, Director of Strategic Partnerships. Mercer leaned back in his chair slowly. So she redirected the payment. Ellison nodded. Which means she knew DeAndre's system was collapsing, and she tried to move the money somewhere safer. Mercer stared at the screen again. But something about this still does not make sense. What? Ellison asked. Laura never had access to the vendor routing controls. Only executives can modify payment destinations. Which meant something else had happened. Someone above Laura Chen had authorized the change. Or she had gained access to an executive account. Mercer began typing quickly. Let me check the system logs. Several seconds passed. Then Mercer froze again. No. What? Ellison asked. Mercer turned the laptop toward us. The payment redirection was approved using an executive login. The account name appeared in bold text. Robert Ellison. The room went completely silent. Ellison stared at the screen. That is impossible. Mercer looked genuinely confused. The system says you authorized the vendor update. Ellison shook his head slowly. I have not logged into the vendor system in weeks. I studied the metadata again. Login time, 3:58 p.m. Location, Executive Terminal, floor 42. That was the main executive floor, where Ellison's office was located. But something about the timestamp stood out. Ellison had not even been in the building at 3:58 p.m. His flight had landed less than an hour earlier. Someone used your credentials again, I said quietly. Ellison's jaw tightened, just like DeAndre did. Mercer looked between us. You are saying someone inside the company is impersonating senior executives to move money? Yes, Ellison replied. And that person just used my account to redirect funds to Laura Chen. Mercer leaned forward slowly, which means Laura might not even know she is being framed. Exactly, I said. The same way DeAndre tried to frame Ellison earlier. Except this time, the stakes were higher. Because whoever redirected that payment knew two things. The investigation had begun, and the system was about to collapse, which meant they were trying to move the remaining money before everything froze. Mercer opened another system window. Let me check something else. He searched the vendor transaction history again. Then another number appeared. Total balance currently stored inside the consulting vendor account. $270,000. Remaining funds. Mercer exhaled slowly. Someone is draining the account before the authorities freeze it. Ellison looked at the hallway. And if they succeed, the evidence disappears, because once the money moves offshore, tracking it becomes much harder. Mercer closed the laptop. We need to stop the transfer immediately. I nodded. Already happening. Because the moment the email notification appeared, the holding company compliance system flagged the payment. Corporate fraud alerts trigger automatic account reviews. Ellison checked his phone, then nodded. Yes. Compliance just froze the vendor account, which meant whoever tried to move the money had failed. But the attempt itself revealed something more important. The person behind the scheme was still active, still inside the company, still trying to protect themselves. Ellison turned toward Mercer. Where is Laura Chen now? Mercer checked his phone. Last message from her was at 7:15 p.m. She said she was heading to a restaurant downtown. Ellison looked at me. We need to find her. Why? Because if someone just framed her using my credentials, she is either part of this or she is the next scapegoat. Either way, she is the key to the entire operation. At that moment, my phone vibrated in my pocket. Unknown number again. I answered. Miss Carter. The voice was calm, professional. FBI, Special Agent Douglas. Yes, we just received a financial alert connected to the Apex Media investigation, a vendor payment redirection attempt. I glanced at Ellison and Mercer. Yes, we saw it too. Agent Douglas continued. That transfer attempt triggered a federal freeze order on the consulting company accounts, which means no one can move the remaining funds anymore. But there is something else. My pulse slowed. What? The attempted transfer included a secondary routing request, meaning someone tried to move the money to a third account if the first transfer failed. And the name on that secondary account was not Laura Chen. The room went silent again, because the second account belonged to someone we had not even considered yet, someone much closer to the top of the company. And when the agent said the name, even Robert Ellison looked stunned, because the account holder was Harold Bishop, the Chief Financial Officer. For a moment after the FBI agent said the name, I thought I had misheard him. Harold Bishop, the Chief Financial Officer. The same man who had been sitting in the boardroom that morning demanding answers. The same man who had called the board. The same man who had looked genuinely shocked by the investigation. I glanced at Ellison. He looked just as stunned. Agent Douglas, I said slowly. Repeat that. The secondary routing request was directed to an account registered under Harold Bishop Consulting Services, LLC. There was a pause. Then the agent added something even worse. That account was opened 3 months ago. Mercer leaned against the desk. 3 months. That meant the account existed long before DeAndre was exposed. Ellison rubbed his temples, which means Harold had a place to move the money before the investigation even started. Exactly, I said. And DeAndre was not the mastermind. He was the middleman. The room felt colder suddenly, because everything we thought we understood about the fraud had just shifted. DeAndre had built the consulting system, but someone above him had expanded it. Someone with access to financial controls. Someone with the authority to move large sums without raising suspicion. The chief financial officer, Mercer whispered. Jesus. Ellison looked toward the hallway. Where is Harold right now? I checked my phone quickly. His calendar had shown a board call at 9:30 p.m., but the executive floor had been empty when we left earlier, which meant he could still be in the building, or he had already left. Ellison spoke quickly. If Harold realized the transfer failed, he might try to run. Agent Douglas spoke again through the phone. Ms. Carter, our system shows Harold Bishop's corporate access card was used 15 minutes ago. Location: underground parking garage. Ellison and I looked at each other. He is leaving, Ellison said. Now. We ran. The elevator ride down to the garage felt endless. Mercer stayed behind to continue reviewing the financial records. But Ellison and I moved quickly through the nearly empty lobby. By the time we reached the underground level, the sound of an engine echoed through the concrete structure. A black sedan sat near the exit ramp, headlights on. Harold Bishop stood beside the driver door, speaking rapidly on his phone. The moment he saw us approaching, his expression changed, from irritation to something much darker, resignation. He ended the call slowly. I wondered how long it would take you to figure it out. His voice was calm, too calm. Ellison stopped a few feet away. Harold, tell me the transfer routing to your account is a coincidence. Harold gave a small, tired laugh. You know better than that. I stepped forward. You built the system, did you not? Harold shook his head slightly. No, DeAndre built the system. I just realized how useful it was. Ellison's jaw tightened. So you turned it into a full operation. Harold nodded once. DeAndre thought he was stealing from the company, but he was actually stealing from me. Silence filled the garage, because suddenly the entire structure of the fraud became clear. DeAndre created the shell company. Departments started using it. But Harold, as chief financial officer, controlled the money flow. He had access to every department budget, every vendor account, every financial approval system, which meant he could quietly redirect payments and nobody would notice, until the numbers grew too large to hide. You were planning to leave, I said. Harold smiled faintly. Tomorrow morning, actually, before the board meeting. The secondary account was supposed to receive the remaining funds tonight, but your compliance system froze the transfer. Ellison stepped closer. You destroyed a company for personal profit. Harold shrugged. Companies destroy themselves every day. I just moved the money before it happened. He looked directly at me. You were supposed to fire DeAndre, close the case, blame everything on one reckless executive. The board would have accepted it, and no one would ever know. But you kept digging, I answered quietly. Because the numbers did not add up. Harold nodded. Yes, you were very thorough. He looked toward the exit ramp, then back at us. But the funny thing is, I almost got away with it. Ellison's voice hardened. The FBI is already on their way. Harold sighed. I figured. He reached into his jacket slowly. Ellison stiffened slightly. But Harold only pulled out his phone. He placed it on the hood of the car. Then he raised his hand slightly. I suppose the game is over. The flashing lights appeared a minute later. 2 federal vehicles rolled into the garage. Agents stepped out quickly. Special Agent Douglas approached Harold. Harold Bishop, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and financial conspiracy. Harold did not resist. The handcuffs clicked into place.
And just like that,
The real architect of the fraud operation was finally exposed. But as they escorted him toward the vehicle, Harold turned his head toward me one last time. You should thank me, he said quietly, because if I had not taken that money, your family would still believe DeAndre was successful, and you would never have discovered what kind of people they really are. The agents pushed him into the car. The door shut. The vehicles drove away. And for the first time in weeks, the entire investigation was finally over. Or at least, that was what I believed at the time. But I had not yet faced the most difficult confrontation of all, my own family, and they were about to arrive. 2 days after Harold Bishop was arrested, the story exploded across every major business news network in the country. Apex Media corporate fraud scandal. Nearly $1 million in embezzled funds. Chief Financial Officer arrested. Regional Vice President indicted. Federal investigation ongoing. But something interesting happened. My name never appeared in the headlines. The holding company handled the crisis exactly the way experienced corporations always do. Quietly, efficiently. They released a single statement. The fraud was discovered during post-acquisition auditing. Responsible individuals have been removed. Full cooperation with federal authorities continues. The story moved on within 48 hours. Corporate scandals rarely stay in the spotlight long. But inside my personal life, the consequences were just beginning. Because that Friday afternoon, my phone rang. Caller ID. Mom. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Nadia. Her voice sounded different. Not angry. Not arrogant, just tired. We need to talk. I leaned back in my office chair. About what? About everything. There was a pause. Your father and I just saw the news. About DeAndre, about the investigation. I said nothing. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for. Did you know? Yes. Another long silence. And then her voice broke slightly. You could have warned us. I looked out the window at the Chicago skyline. You told me not to come to Thanksgiving. You said my presence ruined the vibe. She did not answer. Instead, she whispered, Sienna is here with us. She has been crying for 2 days. The Aspen Resort posts disappeared from social media overnight. The luxury dinners, the expensive clothes, the perfect lifestyle. All of it suddenly looked different once the fraud became public. Mom continued. She did not know about the money. I closed my eyes briefly. Maybe she did. Maybe she did not. But that was no longer my responsibility. Then my father spoke in the background. Put her on speaker. The phone shifted. Nadia. His voice sounded older than I remembered. You destroyed this family. There it was. The accusation I knew was coming. I stayed calm. No. DeAndre destroyed himself. You exposed him, my father said. You could have protected him. You could have protected your sister. I let the silence stretch for several seconds. Then I said something simple. He stole nearly $1 million. My father answered immediately. Family protects family. That sentence hung in the air, and I realized something. Some people believe loyalty means protecting wrongdoing. But loyalty without integrity is just corruption with nicer words. I spoke quietly. I protected the truth. My mother started crying again. Sienna took the phone. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. Nadia, I never thought he was doing anything illegal. I thought he was just successful. I said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. Finally, she whispered, Everything is gone. The house, the cars, the trips. People stopped calling. That is when I asked the question, the one I had been thinking about since Thanksgiving. Sienna, Did you ever once ask where that money came from? She did not answer, because silence can also be an answer. Then she said something quietly. Are you happy now? I looked at the city lights outside my office window. No, I said honestly. But I am peaceful. Peaceful, she repeated. Yes, peace comes from boundaries, not revenge. I heard my mother sniffle again. Can we see you? Maybe talk in person? I thought about it for a moment. Then I answered honestly. Not right now. Another long silence. Finally, my father spoke again. You are really walking away from us? I smiled faintly. No. You walked away first. 2 days before Thanksgiving. The line went quiet. Then my mother whispered something that surprised me. Maybe, she said slowly. Maybe you were the only honest person in this family. We ended the call shortly after. No shouting, no dramatic ending, just silence. 3 months later, the federal case concluded. DeAndre pleaded guilty to multiple fraud charges, 10-year sentence. Harold Bishop received 12. The consulting shell companies were dismantled, the remaining funds were recovered, and Apex Media survived. The board promoted Robert Ellison to Chief Executive Officer, and I received a new title, Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy. But the most important change had nothing to do with promotions. It was quieter than that. Peaceful. One evening in early spring, I sat alone on the balcony of my penthouse, watching the sunset over Lake Michigan. No work calls, no family arguments, just silence and the sound of wind over the water. Sometimes people think revenge is loud, explosive, dramatic. But the most powerful revenge is much simpler. You build a life so stable, so peaceful, that the people who tried to break you no longer have any place in it. Before I end this story, I want to ask you something. If your own family asked you to protect a lie, would you choose loyalty or the truth? Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. And if you want to hear another story about how karma sometimes arrives quietly, make sure you like the video and subscribe, because sometimes the most dangerous revenge is simply walking away.